My name is Thea Garrison, and I'm 29 years old. 4 months ago, in a hospital room where I had just given birth to our daughter, my husband looked at me and said, "That baby isn't mine." He said it in front of two nurses, his mother, and the on-call obstetrician. He said it 11 minutes after I'd been stitched up from a second-degree tear, and then he walked out. He was wrong. The DNA test proved he was the father, but that test uncovered something else, something his mother had spent 33 years hiding. A secret so big that when it came out, it didn't just save my marriage from a lie, it detonated hers. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by the person who was supposed to trust you most, stay with me. This one goes places I couldn't have predicted. Like this story if it grabs you, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from today. Let me take you back. Not to the delivery room. Before that, to the beginning, when I thought I'd married into a good family. I met Nolan Garrison when I was 23, during my second year as a pediatric nurse at Rogue Valley Medical Center in Ashland, Oregon. He came into the ER on a Tuesday night with a fractured wrist from a fall off a ladder while cleaning his gutters. I wasn't his nurse, I was in the pediatric wing, but I was covering a break for a colleague in triage when he walked in holding his wrist against his chest, pale-faced, trying not to pass out. "On a scale of 1 to 10, I said, reaching for the intake form.
11, he said, but I don't want to be dramatic.
He was quiet and polite, and he thanked every single person who touched his arm, including the X-ray technician, who made him wince so hard his eyes watered. I liked him immediately. Not in a dramatic, lightning bolt way. In the way you like someone who is kind when they're in pain. That tells you something about a person. We started dating 3 weeks later. Coffee at a place called Pilgrim's on Main Street. Then dinners, then weekends. By 6 months, I'd met his family. That's when I met Lucille. Lucille Garrison was 59 years old, a retired office manager for a dental practice, and the most precisely controlling woman I have ever encountered. I don't say that with anger anymore. I say it the way you'd describe weather. It's just what she was. She controlled the temperature of every room she entered. She controlled what Nolan wore to family dinners. She controlled the seating arrangement at Thanksgiving, literally, with handwritten place cards in calligraphy she'd learned from a YouTube tutorial. The first time I had dinner at the Garrison house, a beige split level on Maple Crest Drive, Lucille greeted me at the door with a smile that didn't reach past her cheekbones. "So you're the nurse," she said. "Not Thea, not welcome, the nurse." "I am," I said. I extended my hand. She took it with her fingertips, the way you'd pick up something you weren't sure was clean. Dinner was roast chicken with rosemary potatoes and a salad that had exactly the right amount of everything. Lucille asked me 11 questions over the course of 90 minutes. I counted because each one felt like a checkpoint. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? Where did I go to school? Did I rent or own? Did I plan to stay in nursing long-term, or was it a stepping stone? "I love nursing," I said. "It's not a stepping stone, it's the destination." She smiled. That same smile. Cheekbones only. Nolan's father, Gerald, had died of a heart attack 6 years earlier. There was a framed photo of him in the living room, a tall man with a square jaw and light eyes. Nolan looked nothing like him, which I noticed but didn't think about at the time. Nolan had dark hair, a narrower face, brown eyes. Sometimes genetics are just unpredictable. I knew that from nursing school. I didn't give it another thought. That was a mistake. Not because I should have suspected anything, but because Lucille had given that photo a lot more thought than anyone knew. Nolan and I got married 14 months after we started dating. Small ceremony at Lithia Park, under the sycamores, 26 guests. My parents flew in from Boise. My grandmother, my mother's mother, Vera, 81 at the time, came despite a bad hip and sat in the front row in a pale blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Grandma Vera gave me one wedding gift, a hand-knitted baby blanket, cream-colored with pale yellow edges. She'd started it 2 years before I even met Nolan. She told me she had a feeling I'd need it soon. The knitting wasn't perfect. Some rows were tighter than others. One corner had a slight ripple where she'd lost count of her stitches, but it was the softest thing I'd ever touched. "For when the time comes," she said, pressing it into my hands.
Grandma, we just got married. We're not.
"I didn't say now. I said when. Put it somewhere safe." I folded it into a cedar chest at the foot of our bed. It stayed there for 3 years, waiting. Lucille did not attend the wedding. She said she had a stomach virus. Nolan believed her. I didn't, but I chose not to fight about it on my wedding day. That was the first time I swallowed something to keep the peace. It wasn't the last. The first 2 years of marriage were good. Not perfect. Nolan worked long hours at Columbia Regional Bank where he was climbing toward assistant branch manager. I worked rotating shifts at the hospital, including overnights. We were tired a lot. We ate takeout more than we cooked. But we laughed. We talked. On Sunday mornings, he'd make scrambled eggs, and I'd read him the most ridiculous headlines from my phone, and we'd sit at our kitchen table in a rental house on Terrace Street and feel like we'd built something real. The problem was never us. The problem arrived through the side door, the way it always does with someone like Lucille. Not a confrontation, never a confrontation. A comment, a question, a carefully placed seed. "Does Thea work a lot of nights with Dr. Ando?" Lucille asked Nolan once, casually over the phone. I heard it on speaker while making dinner. Dr. Ando was a male pediatrician I worked with regularly. He was 47, married with 3 kids, and had never once behaved inappropriately toward me or anyone. "Yeah, they're on the same rotation," Nolan said, not thinking anything of it. Lucille said, "That's all." One syllable. But it was the first seed. And seeds don't need much to grow. They just need time, and a mind that's already a little unsure of itself. Nolan was confident on the surface, but fragile underneath. He'd grown up as the only child of a woman who made him feel like love was conditional, earned through obedience, maintained through compliance. He didn't know how to trust fully because he'd never been trusted fully. Lucille praised him when he did what she wanted and withdrew when he didn't, and that pattern, perform, earn, receive, was the only model of love he understood. I didn't see that clearly until it was too late. I saw a kind man with a fractured wrist who thanked his nurses. I didn't see the cracks running underneath. And by the time those cracks split open, I was in a hospital bed holding our newborn daughter, bleeding through my stitches, being told by the man I loved that the baby in my arms wasn't his. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I got pregnant in January. We'd been trying for 4 months. Not long, but long enough for Lucille to make comments. "Some women just aren't built for it," she told Nolan at a Sunday lunch I wasn't present for. He repeated it to me that evening, not to hurt me, but because he genuinely didn't understand why it stung. When the test came back positive, I cried in our bathroom on Terrace Street for 10 minutes. Happy tears, the kind that make your whole face hot. Nolan held me and said, "We did it." And I believed that "we" meant something unbreakable. I called Grandma Vera first. She picked up on the second ring. "Get the blanket out of the cedar chest," I said. She didn't say anything for 3 seconds. Then she laughed, the kind of laugh that sounds like crying if you're not paying attention. "I told you. I had a feeling." I called my parents next. Then Nolan called Lucille. I was standing close enough to hear her response through the phone. She said, "Well, that's news." Not congratulations, not excitement. That's news. The way you'd respond to being told the plumber is running late. Over the next 8 months, Lucille built her case. I didn't know it was a case at the time. I thought it was just her being difficult, being controlling, being Lucille. But looking back, every move was calculated. Every comment had a destination. It started with questions about my schedule. "You're still doing overnights?" she asked at a family dinner in March, 5 months into my pregnancy. "At the hospital? Alone with the other staff?" "I'm a nurse, Lucille. That's how shifts work." "I just worry," she said. "Nolan's home alone so many nights, and you're there with all those people." All those people. She said it the way you'd say, all those germs. Then came the comments about my appearance. Small, surgical. "You're carrying very small for how far along you are," she said at Easter, studying my belly like she was appraising furniture. My friend Doreen's daughter carried small too. Turned out the dates were off by almost 2 months. She paused, let the implication land. The baby came early, or late, depending on how you count. I told Nolan about the comment that night. He shrugged. "That's just Mom. She says weird things." He shrugged. That's the sentence I replay the most, because every time he shrugged off something his mother said, he gave her another inch of space to work in, and she used every inch. In June, 7 months pregnant, I discovered the first piece of real evidence that Lucille was doing more than making comments. I found it by accident. Nolan left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. It buzzed. I glanced at it, not snooping, just reflexive. The notification was a text from Lucille. The preview showed a screenshot. I could only see the top edge of it, what looked like a social media message exchange. The preview text from Lucille read, "I didn't want to show you this, but you need to see who she really is." My stomach dropped. Not the baby kicking. Something colder. I didn't open the phone. I should have. Instead, I waited. I watched Nolan after his shower. He checked his phone, stared at it for about 40 seconds, then put it face down on the nightstand. He didn't say anything to me, but he was quiet the rest of the evening. A different kind of quiet than his normal. Heavier. Over the next 6 weeks, Nolan changed. He started asking where I was during shifts, not casually, specifically. "Were you on the 3rd floor the whole time? Who else was working last night? Did you see Dr. Ando?" The questions had Lucille's fingerprints all over them. The same specificity, the same targets. She was feeding him something, and he was digesting it without telling me what it was. I tried to talk to him. Twice. The first time he said, "I'm fine, just stressed about the baby coming." The second time he said, "Drop it, Thea," in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Flat. Final. I dropped it. 7.5 months pregnant, exhausted from shifts, swollen feet, back pain. I didn't have the energy to fight a war I didn't even know was happening. I found out later, much later, exactly what Lucille had done. She had created a fake Instagram profile using photos of a real man from Portland. She'd used this profile to send flirtatious direct messages to my actual Instagram account. I never saw them because they went to my message requests, which I never checked. But Lucille screenshotted the sent messages from the fake account's side, making it look like an ongoing conversation. She then showed these screenshots to Nolan, one at a time, over the course of 2 months. She manufactured an affair that never existed. She built it piece by piece, screenshot by screenshot, question by question, until her son looked at the woman carrying his child and saw a stranger. Our daughter was born on August 14th at 3:47 a.m. at Rogue Valley Medical Center, the same hospital where I worked, where I'd cared for hundreds of babies, where my colleagues knew me by name. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, 10 fingers, 10 toes, a full head of dark hair that looked exactly like Nolan's. The delivery was difficult. 18 hours of labor, 2nd-degree tear. I was exhausted in a way that goes past tired into something almost spiritual, like my body had done everything it could and was asking permission to shut down. They placed her on my chest. She was warm and slippery, and her eyes were squeezed shut, and she made a sound. Not a cry, more like a sigh, that I felt in my collarbone. I said her name for the first time out loud. "Hi, Margot." Nolan was in the room. He'd been there for the delivery. He'd held my hand. He'd said the right things. But something was off. He was present the way a mannequin is present, physically there, emotionally sealed behind glass. Lucille arrived 20 minutes after Margot was born. She walked in with a gift bag and a smile that covered the room like a coat of paint, even, controlled, hiding whatever was underneath. She looked at the baby in my arms and said, "She doesn't look much like the Garrisons." Margot was 20 minutes old. 20 minutes. Nolan stiffened. I saw it. His shoulders pulled up half an inch. His jaw tightened. "Lucille, she was just born," I said. Babies don't look like anyone yet. Of course, Lucille said. I'm just observing. She stayed for 40 minutes. She held Margot for less than 2 of them. When she left, she squeezed Nolan's arm at the door and said something I couldn't hear. But I saw his face after she said it. The color left his cheeks like someone had opened a drain. 11 minutes after Lucille left, 2 nurses, colleagues of mine, women I'd worked beside for years, came in to check my stitches and vitals. They were in the room when Nolan stood up from the chair by the window, looked at me holding our daughter, and said it. That baby isn't mine. He said it flat, rehearsed, like he'd been practicing the sentence in his head for weeks and had finally found the moment to release it. Nolan, what are you— I've seen the messages, Thea. I know about the guy. My mom showed me everything. Nurse Janet Rios, a woman I'd worked with for 4 years, froze with a blood pressure cuff in her hand. Nurse Debbie Soto, standing by the IV stand, looked at me with wide eyes. What messages? What guy? Nolan, I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't. Just don't. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. I want a DNA test. Until then, don't call me. He walked out, past Janet, past Debbie, past the bassinet where Margot was about to be placed. He didn't look at the baby. He didn't look at me. He walked down the corridor of the hospital where I had spent 5 years caring for other people's children, and he left me bleeding and alone with ours. Janet put the blood pressure cuff down slowly. Debbie came to the side of my bed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Janet, quiet, practical, a 20-year veteran who'd seen everything, said, "Whatever just happened, your blood pressure needs to stay down. Look at me. Breathe." I breathed. I held Margot, and I felt the world I'd built crack down the center like a tile hit with a hammer. On the bedside table, folded inside a plastic bag, was the cream-colored baby blanket with pale yellow edges. Grandma Vera's blanket, the one she'd started knitting before I even met Nolan. I'd brought it to the hospital for Margot's first night. 2 hours later, when a nurse moved my things to a recovery room, the blanket was gone. Nolan had taken it. I found out 3 days later that he'd thrown it in the garbage bin behind our house on Terrace Street. He threw away my grandmother's blanket, the one she knitted with hands that were starting to shake from arthritis, the one she made because she had a feeling. That was the moment I stopped crying and started thinking. I left the hospital 2 days after giving birth with a baby in a car seat and nowhere to go. Nolan had changed the locks on the house on Terrace Street. He did it the day after Margot was born. I know because I drove there first, out of habit, and my key didn't turn. I stood on my own porch, holding a 2-day-old baby and a diaper bag, and tried my key 3 times before I accepted what was happening. I called my mother in Boise. She answered on the first ring. She'd been waiting since I'd texted her from the hospital that something had gone wrong. I couldn't get the full story out. I kept starting and stopping. She said, "Come home." But Boise was 6 hours away, and I had a newborn and my stitches were pulling, and I could barely sit in a car seat for 10 minutes without pain. Instead, I drove to the only person in Ashland I trusted completely. Gemma Hollis lived in a small blue house on Granite Street, 12 minutes from the hospital. She was 58, a senior lab technician at Rogue Valley Medical, and she'd worked there longer than almost anyone. She had gray-streaked red hair she kept in a braid down her back, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a voice that sounded like someone who'd spent decades being calm in rooms where calm was hard to find. I'd known Gemma for 4 years. She wasn't my supervisor or my boss. She ran the pathology lab on the 2nd floor, and our paths crossed because pediatric samples often went through her department. We started talking over coffee in the break room, first about work, then about life. She was the one who told me, 2 years ago over a vending machine lunch, that her own marriage had ended over a paternity accusation. "My ex-husband's family convinced him our youngest wasn't his," she'd said, unwrapping a granola bar. "He demanded a test. The test proved he was the father. But by then the damage was done. You can't unring that bell. I remembered that conversation. I remembered thinking how awful it sounded, how irrational, how it could never happen to me. I was wrong about the last part. I showed up on Gemma's porch at 4:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, holding Margot in her car seat, my hospital bag over one shoulder, mascara from 2 days ago smeared under my eyes. Gemma opened the door, looked at me, looked at the baby, and said, "Spare bedrooms made up, bathrooms on the left. I'll put the kettle on." She didn't ask what happened. Not right away. She let me put Margot down. She let me sit. She made tea, chamomile, too hot, in a mug that said, "Lab rats do it with precision." And then she sat across from me at her kitchen table and said, "Tell me." I told her everything. The accusation, the nurses witnessing it, the locked door, the messages Nolan mentioned, messages I'd never seen, from a person I didn't know. Lucille's comments, the blanket, all of it. Gemma listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses, cleaned them on her shirt, put them back on, and said, "The messages. That's the key. Someone built those. Messages don't appear from nowhere." You think, Lucille? I think you need to see exactly what Nolan was shown. And then you need to prove where it came from. But first, you need the DNA test. Because until paternity is confirmed, everything else is noise. She was right. The DNA test was the foundation. Without it, nothing else mattered. The next morning, Gemma drove me to a private lab called Pacific Genetics on Siskiyou Boulevard. She knew the intake coordinator, a woman named Priya, and she'd called ahead. I brought Margot. They swabbed the inside of her cheek with a cotton tip while she slept. She didn't even flinch. Getting Nolan's sample was harder. Oregon law required both parents to consent for a legal paternity test, or I'd need a court order. But Nolan wanted the test too. He'd said so in the delivery room. So I texted him, the first contact since he'd walked out. "You said you wanted a DNA test. Pacific Genetics on Siskiyou. They need your swab. You can go anytime." He responded 4 hours later. One word. Fine. He went the next day. Priya confirmed it. Results would take 7 to 10 business days. 7 to 10 days. That's how long I had to wait to prove that my daughter belonged to her father. 168 to 240 hours of sitting in Gemma's spare bedroom, nursing Margot at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering how a woman I'd tried to be kind to for 5 years had dismantled my family with a fake Instagram account and a handful of screenshots. During that waiting period, 2 things happened. First, Gemma helped me understand what I was probably dealing with. She sat me down at her kitchen table on day 3 with her laptop open to a page about catfishing and fabricated digital evidence. "If Lucille made a fake profile," Gemma said, "the messages will have metadata, timestamps, account creation dates. If the profile was made recently and the conversation started after you were already pregnant, the timeline will prove it's manufactured." How do I get access to the fake profile? You start by finding it. What did Nolan say exactly? He said messages. From a guy. So somewhere there's a profile that sent you messages. Check your Instagram requests. I hadn't opened Instagram in months. My account was mostly dormant. I posted maybe twice a year, usually photos of food or the view from the hospital parking lot at sunrise. I opened the app on Gemma's couch, navigated to my message requests, and there it was. 14 messages from an account called @drew.k. Drew.k.Mitchell. A profile picture of a dark-haired man in sunglasses, early 30s, standing on what looked like a hiking trail. The messages spanned from March to July, almost the entirety of my pregnancy. They started casual. "Hey, saw your profile, you seem cool." They escalated. Compliments, then suggestive comments, then explicit. I had never seen any of them, not one. They sat in my requests folder, unread, unanswered. But from the sender side, from Lucille's side, if she controlled the account, they would have looked like a conversation she could screenshot selectively. "Look at the account," Gemma said, leaning over my shoulder. I tapped the profile. At drew.k.mitchell, 23 posts, all generic, hiking photos, coffee cups, a sunset, no tagged friends, no comments from real people, 12 followers, all with default profile pictures. The account was created in February, 1 month after I got pregnant. Created in February, I said. 1 month after your positive test, Gemma said. That's not a coincidence. That's a schedule. The second thing that happened during the waiting period was smaller but cut deeper. On day 5, I went back to the house on Terrace Street while Nolan was at work. Not to go inside, I didn't have a key. I went to check the garbage bins in the alley behind the house. I don't know why. Something pulled me there. Maybe I just needed to see if it was true. The bins had been emptied, but behind the green bin, caught against the fence post where the wind had pushed it, was a ball of cream-colored yarn. Tangled, dirty, stepped on. Part of the blanket. Not the whole thing, just a piece. A strip of pale yellow edging that had unraveled when the blanket was crushed into the garbage. I picked it up, held it against my chest. It smelled like rain and garbage and something faintly like cedar, the chest where it had waited for 3 years. I put it in my pocket. I still have it. A strip of yarn from a blanket my grandmother knitted with shaking hands because she had a feeling. If you've ever held a piece of something destroyed, something that was made with love and thrown away by someone who didn't understand what it was, then you know exactly what I felt standing in that alley. And you know that feeling doesn't make you sad. It makes you certain. Certain that the person who did this needs to face the truth. The DNA results were 5 days away. The results came on a Tuesday. Day 9. Gemma drove me to Pacific Genetics because my hands were shaking too badly to trust myself behind the wheel. Margot was in the back seat in her car seat, asleep, wearing a onesie with tiny elephants on it that Gemma had bought from a thrift store on Oak Street. Priya met us at the front desk. She handed me a sealed envelope, standard white, business-sized, with the Pacific Genetics logo in the corner. My name and Nolan's printed on the label. Our daughter's future inside a piece of paper. Do you want a private room? Priya asked. No, I said. I'll open it here. I stood at the counter, Gemma beside me, and I tore the envelope open. 1 sheet of paper, a table of numbers, allele markers, probability calculations, and at the bottom, in bold, probability of paternity, 99.9998%. Nolan Garrison was Margot's father. There was no affair, no other man, no secret. My daughter was exactly who I said she was. Ours. His and mine. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I felt something closer to exhaustion. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath underwater and you finally break the surface, and the relief is so total that your body doesn't know whether to laugh or collapse. Gemma read the result over my shoulder. She nodded once. There it is. There it is, I repeated. I texted Nolan a photo of the result. No caption, no commentary. Just the page, the numbers, the 99.9998%. He read it within 4 minutes. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then nothing. No response. For 3 hours, nothing. But the DNA results had a second page. I didn't notice it at first. I was so focused on the paternity number that I almost folded the papers back into the envelope without reading further. But Gemma, careful, methodical, 26 years in a lab, said, "There's another sheet." The second page was a supplementary genetic analysis. Pacific Genetics offered optional ancestry and genetic marker breakdowns with their paternity tests. I hadn't requested it, but Nolan apparently had. He'd checked a box on his intake form for a full genetic profile. The second page compared Nolan's genetic markers against the standard paternity index. And there was a note at the bottom: clinical, neutral, the kind of language labs use when they find something unexpected. Genetic markers indicate that the tested male subject's paternal lineage is inconsistent with the documented family pedigree provided during intake. Recommend follow-up genetic consultation. I read it twice. Then I looked at Gemma. What does this mean? Gemma took the page, read it slowly. Her expression didn't change, but her breathing did. It got very still, the way it does when someone with decades of experience recognizes something significant. It means Nolan's DNA doesn't match his father's side, she said carefully. The markers they'd expect to see from Gerald Garrison's lineage, they're not there. That could mean a lot of things, right? Lab variation or... It could. But with these numbers, it probably means one thing. She looked at me over her reading glasses. Gerald Garrison was not Nolan's biological father. The room tilted. Not literally, but the way it does when a piece of information lands that rearranges everything you thought you understood about a situation. Lucille, the woman who had accused me of carrying another man's baby, who had fabricated evidence of an affair, who had convinced her son that his wife was a liar, had been hiding the exact same secret for 33 years. Nolan wasn't Gerald's son. Lucille had gotten pregnant by someone else, carried the baby, and raised him as Gerald's child without anyone knowing. For 33 years. Through a marriage, through Gerald's death 6 years ago, through family gatherings and photo albums and a framed picture in the living room of a man whose square jaw and light eyes Nolan never inherited because they were never his to inherit. Gemma set the paper down on the counter. She projected, Gemma said quietly. Everything she accused you of, the affair, the baby that wasn't her son's, that's her story, not yours. She saw her own secret in your situation, and she tried to destroy you before anyone could connect the dots. I stood in that genetics lab holding proof that I was innocent, and proof that my accuser was guilty of the exact thing she'd accused me of. The symmetry was so precise it felt like fiction. But it wasn't. It was documented. It was in the numbers. It was in the allele markers and the probability calculations and the cold clinical language of a lab report that didn't care about family politics or social performance or carefully constructed lies. I didn't confront Lucille. Not yet. Instead, I did what needed to happen first. I talked to Nolan. He came to Gemma's house the following evening. It was the first time I'd seen him since the delivery room. He looked thinner, dark circles under his eyes. He stood on Gemma's porch with his hands in his pockets, unable to look at me directly.
Can I see her?
He asked, meaning Margot. She's sleeping, I said. You can come in, but we need to talk first. We sat at Gemma's kitchen table. Gemma took Margot to the spare bedroom and closed the door, giving us privacy. Nolan sat across from me, staring at the wood grain like it contained instructions for what to say.
The test,
he started.
I saw the results.
And?
She's mine.
His voice cracked on the second word.
I know she's mine.
I knew. I think part of me knew the whole time. But my mom kept showing me things, and I...
What things, Nolan? What exactly did she show you?
He told me. Screenshots of Instagram messages. The @drew.k.mitchell account. 14 messages that Lucille presented as proof that I was having a conversation with another man throughout my pregnancy. She'd shown them one at a time, starting in March, escalating through the summer. Each time with the same framing. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but you deserve to know. Did you ever check my phone? I asked. Did you ever look at my account to see if I'd actually responded to any of those messages? He stared at the table.
No.
Did you ask me? Even once?
No.
You let your mother show you fabricated screenshots from a fake account she created, and you didn't ask me a single question. You accused me in front of my colleagues. You changed the locks. You threw away my grandmother's blanket. He flinched at the blanket.
That one landed.
I know, he whispered. I know what I did. I slid the second page of the DNA report across the table. There's something else you need to see. He read it, slowly. I watched his face cycle through confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like vertigo, the expression of a person whose foundation has just dissolved beneath them. This says my dad wasn't... He couldn't finish. Your genetic markers don't match Gerald's lineage. The lab recommends follow-up consultation. But the numbers are clear, Nolan. Gerald Garrison was not your biological father. He sat back in his chair, both hands flat on the table, staring at nothing. Your mother spent 2 months convincing you that your wife's baby wasn't yours, I said. She did it because she's been living with the reality that her husband's baby wasn't his. For 33 years. She projected her secret onto me. She destroyed our family to protect a lie she's been carrying since before you were born. Nolan didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and wet, and he looked like a man who had just lost 2 parents. The father he thought was his, and the mother he thought he knew. I need to talk to her, he said. You do, I said, but not tonight. Tonight your daughter is in the next room, and she hasn't met her father yet. Not really. I opened the spare bedroom door. Gemma was sitting in a rocking chair reading a paperback. Margot was awake, lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling with the wide, unfocused gaze of a newborn discovering light. Nolan walked in. He stood over the bed, looking down at his daughter. Then he picked her up, carefully, one hand under her head, the way I'd taught dozens of new fathers to do in the hospital, and he held her against his chest. He didn't say anything. He just stood there breathing with his daughter in his arms, crying quietly, while Gemma and I watched from the doorway. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a beginning, the smallest, most fragile kind. The christening was my idea, not for religious reasons, though my grandmother Vera would have appreciated that. I wanted it because it was the right context. A public ceremony, a family gathering, a community event centered on Margot, and because Lucille would never miss it. A christening was exactly the kind of event she'd attend in full performance mode. The devoted grandmother, the matriarch, the woman holding the family together. She wouldn't be able to resist. The ceremony was scheduled for the last Sunday of September at Grace Lutheran Church on Siskiyou Boulevard. Pastor David Keenan, a soft-spoken man with a gray ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses, had baptized 3 babies I'd cared for in the NICU. He knew me. He trusted me. When I asked if there would be time after the baptism for a few words from the family, he said, "Of course. That's what the gathering is for." I didn't tell Nolan everything I planned. I told him enough. That I wanted to address the family, that I wanted to set the record straight, that I wouldn't attack his mother publicly. He was hesitant. He'd confronted Lucille 4 days after seeing the DNA results. He told me about it over the phone, his voice flat and tired.
She denied it at first,
He said.
She said the lab made an error. She said genetic tests are unreliable. She said Dad had a cousin with similar markers and maybe there was overlap.
And then?
And then I told her I'd do a second test, a full ancestry panel, that I'd find out who my biological father is. And she went quiet, really quiet. And she said, "Some things are better left alone, Nolan."
That's not a denial.
No, it's not.
He didn't tell me whether she admitted it. I think she didn't. Not fully. She retreated into the same fog of partial truths that she'd used on everyone else for decades. But the ground had shifted. Nolan knew it. She knew he knew it. And for a woman whose entire identity was built on controlling what other people believed, that loss of control was its own kind of unraveling. 63 people attended Margot's christening. I know because Pastor Keenan counted the chairs afterward. He told me it was the biggest baptism turnout he'd had in 4 years. Family from both sides. My parents from Boise. 2 of my cousins. Nolan's Aunt Diane, who was Gerald's sister and who had driven up from Medford. Colleagues from the hospital. Neighbors. Members of the congregation who came because that's what you do at Grace Lutheran on a Sunday. And Lucille. Table 2, front row, wearing a lavender dress with pearl earrings. She arrived early, 9:40 a.m. for a 10 o'clock service, and positioned herself near the baptismal font like she was part of the ceremony. She brought a gift bag with tissue paper. She smiled at everyone who passed. She was in full performance. I arrived with Margot at 9:55. cream-colored dress, Margot in a white christening gown my mother had found at a vintage shop in Boise. And around Margot's shoulders, draped loosely, tucked around her tiny body, was the remnant of Grandma Vera's blanket. Not the whole blanket, it was gone. But Vera, when I told her what had happened, had taken the strip of pale yellow edging I'd rescued from the alley and used it as the border for a new, smaller blanket. Same cream yarn, same pattern, same slightly uneven stitches. She'd knitted it in 8 days with hands that shook the entire time. "He can throw away a blanket," Vera had said on the phone, her voice like wire pulled tight. "He can't throw away what it means." When I walked into the church holding Margot wrapped in that blanket, Lucille's eyes went straight to it. I saw the recognition cross her face. The color, the yarn, the yellow edging she'd seen once at the baby shower she'd reluctantly attended. She knew what it was, and she knew what it meant. That something she thought had been discarded had come back. The baptism itself was brief and beautiful. Pastor Keenan poured water over Margot's head. She didn't cry. She blinked twice and then yawned, which made the entire congregation laugh. I held her. Nolan stood beside me, not touching me, not distant, present in the complicated, unresolved way that two people occupy the same space when they haven't yet decided what they are to each other. After the baptism, Pastor Keenan invited family to share words. My mother spoke first, short, warm, a few sentences about welcoming Margot into the family. Then Nolan's Aunt Diane said something kind about Gerald and how he would have loved to meet his granddaughter. Lucille nodded vigorously at this, performing agreement, as if the mention of Gerald's name was a shield she could hold up. Then Nolan stood. I hadn't told him what to say. I hadn't coached him or scripted him. I'd said, "If you want to speak, speak. If you don't, don't." He'd told me the night before that he wanted to. He didn't tell me what he'd planned. He walked to the front of the church. He stood beside the baptismal font, hands at his sides, and he looked out at 63 faces, family, friends, colleagues, community, and he started talking. "I want to thank everyone for being here for Margot." His voice was steady but thin, like a wire holding more weight than it was built for. "Being a new parent is the hardest thing I've ever done. Not because of the sleepless nights or the diapers, because I almost missed it." He paused. The room was quiet. "A few months ago, I was told something about my wife. I was told that our daughter might not be mine. I was shown what I believed was evidence, and I accepted it without question. I accused Thea in a hospital room, hours after she gave birth, in front of her colleagues. I walked out. I changed the locks on our home. I threw away something that belonged to her family, something irreplaceable, because I was angry, and I didn't stop to think." I watched the room. My mother's hands were clasped tight in her lap. My father's jaw was set. Janet Rios, my colleague from the hospital, was in the 4th row. She'd come because I'd invited her. She was sitting very still, watching Nolan with the expression of a woman who'd been in that delivery room and had waited months to hear this. "The DNA test proved that Margot is my daughter, 100%. The evidence I was shown was fabricated. The messages were fake. The account they came from was created specifically to destroy my marriage. And I believed it because I didn't trust my wife enough to ask her directly." Dorothy from my book club, not the same Dorothy from the previous script, a different woman entirely, Dorothy Chen, a librarian at the Ashland branch, leaned toward her husband and whispered something. Her husband's eyes widened. Lucille was at table 2. Her smile was gone. Not replaced by anger or shame, replaced by stillness. A particular kind of stillness I'd seen before. The stillness of a person calculating escape routes. "I'm not going to name who showed me the fabricated evidence," Nolan continued. "Most of you can figure that out. What I will say is that the person who convinced me my wife was lying had their own reasons. Reasons that had nothing to do with protecting me or my family. They were protecting themselves from a truth they've been hiding for a very long time." The air shifted. I could feel it. 63 people breathing differently. Diane, Gerald's sister, uncrossed her arms slowly. She turned her head, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to look at Lucille from the corner of her eye. Nolan's voice tightened but held.
I stood in this church today, and I baptized my daughter, and I watched my wife hold her in a blanket that was made by her grandmother and destroyed by me and remade by that same grandmother because that's what love does. It rebuilds. And I'm standing here telling you this because Thea deserves to have the truth said out loud, in front of the people who matter, by the person who owes it. He looked at me, direct, no performance. I'm sorry, Thea. Not the kind of sorry that fixes things, the kind that starts the work. He stepped back. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Janet Rios started clapping, slow, deliberate. My mother joined. Then scattered applause that built across the room. Not a standing ovation, not a celebration, but an acknowledgement. The sound of people recognizing that something true had just been said. Gemma was in the 5th row. She wasn't clapping. She was looking at me with an expression I recognized from every late night in her kitchen. Steady, warm. The face of a woman who knew exactly how hard the road to this moment had been. Diane stood up and walked directly to me. She took both my hands. I knew something was wrong, she said, quiet enough that only I could hear. Gerald would have been furious. He loved Nolan more than anything, and he would have loved you too.
Behind Diane, I could see her friend Carol Hutchins, a woman who'd known the Garrison family for 20 years, leaning toward the woman beside her, whispering. The whisper traveled. I watched it move through the pews like a current. Pastor Keenan, standing near the altar, caught my eye and gave me a small nod. Not a religious gesture, a human one. The nod of a man who understood that what just happened in his church was more than a christening.
After the ceremony, the gathering moved to the church hall for coffee and cake. This is where Lucille made her move. She approached me near the refreshment table, where I was holding Margot against my shoulder. She was carrying the gift bag she'd brought, still full, still wrapped in tissue paper. Her smile was back, recalibrated, warmer than before, wider, designed to communicate that whatever had just happened in the sanctuary was a misunderstanding, a family hiccup, something that could be smoothed over with the right gesture.
Thea, sweetheart, she said, reaching for Margot, both hands extended, the grandmother reclaiming her role. Let me hold my granddaughter. The word sweetheart landed like a counterfeit bill, the right shape, the wrong weight. I didn't pull away dramatically. I didn't make a scene. I simply turned my body 45 degrees so that Margot was on my far shoulder, away from Lucille's reaching hands. A small rotation, the kind that could be accidental if you weren't paying attention. But people were paying attention. She just fell asleep, Lucille, I said, calm, polite, the voice of a nurse managing a difficult situation. I don't want to disturb her. Lucille's hands hung in the air for a moment. Then they dropped. She recovered quickly, she always did, and redirected to the gift bag. I brought something for her, a little outfit. Can I put it with the other gifts? Of course, I said. The gift table is over there. She walked to the gift table. She set the bag down carefully, adjusted the tissue paper so it fanned out perfectly, and then stood there for a moment, alone, in a room full of people who were looking at her differently than they had an hour ago. Diane was watching from across the hall, coffee cup in hand, her face unreadable. Carol Hutchins was beside her, no longer whispering. Janet Rios was near the door, arms folded, her eyes tracking Lucille the way a nurse tracks a patient who might be a fall risk. My mother approached Lucille. I didn't hear what she said, but I saw Lucille's face tighten, then release into that automatic smile, and I saw my mother nod once, politely, firmly, and walk away. My mother later told me she'd said 4 words. I hope you understand. Lucille left the church hall at 11:15 a.m. She didn't say goodbye to Nolan. She didn't approach me again. She walked out through the side door, alone, carrying nothing. The gift bag stayed on the table. The lavender dress disappeared through the doorway and into the parking lot, and that was the last time I saw Lucille Garrison in person. Nolan moved out of the house on Terrace Street 2 weeks after the christening. Not because I asked him to, because he said he needed to earn the right to come back, and he couldn't do that from inside the space where he'd changed the locks on his wife and thrown away her grandmother's blanket. He rented a studio apartment on C Street, 4 blocks from Gemma's house. He started therapy, a counselor named Martin Webb who specialized in family enmeshment. He went every Thursday at 5 p.m. I know because he told me, not to prove anything, but because he said he wanted me to know he was doing the work even when I wasn't watching. We co-parented. He came to Gemma's every other evening to spend time with Margot. He held her. He fed her. He learned the specific way she liked to be rocked, slightly to the left with one hand on her lower back. He was clumsy at first, nervous. He held her like she was made of something that might dissolve in his hands. But he kept showing up, every scheduled evening. Never late, never excused. One Thursday in October, after his therapy session, he came by to see Margot and stayed longer than usual. Gemma had taken her evening walk, 40 minutes around the neighborhood, same route every night, rain or shine. Nolan and I were alone in the kitchen. Margot was asleep in the portable crib in the living room. "Martin asked me something today," Nolan said, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Not defensive, tired. "He asked me when I first started believing my mom over my own judgment." "What did you say?" "I said always. I said I couldn't remember a time when I didn't check with her first before trusting what I thought." He paused. "That's not normal, is it?" "No," I said. "It's not." "She hasn't called me in 12 days, he said. "That's the longest she's ever gone." "How does that feel?" He thought about it, really thought. "Like the house is quiet for the first time. But I don't know if it's peaceful or empty. I can't tell yet." That was the most honest thing Nolan had ever said to me. Not a performance, not a reaction. A real observation from a man slowly learning to hear his own voice instead of his mother's. I didn't say I forgive you. I wasn't there. I don't know if I'll ever fully get there. Some things leave marks that don't disappear. They just become part of the landscape. The accusation in the delivery room, Janet and Debbie's faces, the locked door, the blanket in the garbage. Those moments live in my body. They tighten my chest when I think about them. They probably always will. But I told him something that was true. "You're doing the work, Nolan. I can see it. That matters." He nodded. He didn't push for more. He finished his water, kissed Margot's forehead, and left. Gemma and I sat on her porch that evening after Nolan left. October in Ashland. Cool air, smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. The sky turning that deep purple it gets right before full dark. "You going to move back into the house eventually?" she asked, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I don't know yet. Maybe. Maybe somewhere new, somewhere that doesn't have his mother's fingerprints on every wall." You know what my therapist told me 20 years ago when my situation blew up? What? She said, "You don't have to decide the whole future right now. You just have to decide tomorrow." I thought it was a greeting card line. Took me about 5 years to realize it was the smartest thing anyone ever said to me. I laughed. It surprised me, the sound of my own laughter in the quiet evening air. I hadn't laughed much in the past few months. It felt like a muscle I'd forgotten I had. "Thank you, Gemma," I said. "For the spare room, for the tea, for driving me to the lab, for all of it." She waved her hand dismissively. "You would have figured it out without me." "Maybe, but I would have figured it out alone. That's different." She looked at me over her reading glasses, then she smiled. Not a big smile, just a shift at the corners of her mouth, and said, "Yeah, it is." Last week, I moved into my own apartment. A 1-bedroom on Hellman Street, 6 minutes from the hospital. Small, clean, mine. Margot's crib is against the wall by the window where the morning light comes in warm and soft. On the morning of our first night there, I unpacked the last box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the blanket. The new one, Grandma Vera's reconstruction. Cream-colored, pale yellow edging, slightly uneven stitches, one corner with a ripple where she lost count. The same imperfection as the original. She'd done it on purpose. I unfolded it and laid it in Margot's crib. Margot was lying on her back, hands curled into fists, watching the light move across the ceiling. I tucked the blanket around her, not tight, just enough to touch her skin. She turned her head toward the fabric, and her fist uncurled and her fingers found the yellow edge, and she held on.
Vera called that afternoon. I told her about the blanket, about Margot's fingers finding the yellow edge. Of course she did, Vera said. That's what it was made for. Holding on. Nolan and I are not together, not apart. We're in the space between. The space where two people who broke something are figuring out if they want to build something new or let the pieces rest where they fell. I don't know which one we'll choose. Some days I think we'll make it. Some days I think the delivery room will always be louder than anything that comes after. But Margot has a father who shows up. She has a mother who fought for the truth. She has a great-grandmother who knits with shaking hands. And she has a blanket that was made and destroyed and made again. Because some things are too important to stay broken. If you've ever been accused of something you didn't do by someone you loved, if you know what it feels like to hold proof of your innocence in your hands and realize that being right doesn't fix what was broken, then you understand this story. It's not about winning. It's about the truth surviving. My daughter's name is Margot. She's 4 months old. She sleeps under a blanket her great-grandmother knitted twice. And when she's old enough, I'll tell her the story of how she got here. Not the version edited for convenience, the real one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe if you haven't. And if you've ever had someone try to erase your truth and failed, tell me about it in the comments. Your story matters too.